Hello friends, my name is Satchel Like a Bag Drakes, and this time around we'll be looking at Super Mario 64, Mega Man X, and the introduction of the Z-axis. How did these two titles fare out in the industry transition from 2D to 3D?
So Mario and Mega Man are two iconic figures that both saw a heyday and a home on the Nintendo console. Though Mega Man belonged to Team Capcom, it's fairly difficult to unhinge the relationship he had with the NES and SNES systems.
The Blue Bomber has headlined a handful of classic titles that have influenced the visual, aural, and mechanical elements of games for over a decade. Likewise, Mario ain't too shabby either, but though Mario's legacy lives on and is unarguably still being written in present titles, Mega Man's latter gen offerings wavered in garnering quite the same magnitude of anticipation or excitement.
Don't mishear me, Mega Man is still a somewhat breathing, or in the least revivable franchise that has seen some victories, and the Super Mario series hasn't endured without a few chinks in the armor either.
But somewhere along the line, Mega Man fans had to lean on his legacy more than his trajectory, his past more than his future, just to get a sense of appreciation. Game-related message boards and blogs have taken liberties in speculating over the admittedly uncertain future of Mega Man, with witty back and forths on its fringe titles, failures, and successes, but mostly failures. And it doesn't go without proof. Capcom has cancelled Mega Man Online, Mega Man Universe, Mega Man Legends 3, and the weird Maverick Hunter first-person shooter all around the same period, with no substantial titles to carry this franchise on. It's hard to see why Capcom believes that we're less interested enough in Mega Man for the series to live on.
I mean, let's be real, they're not a small business and have quite a team of individuals who are likely capable of reading analytics well, so maybe hype isn't actually as hot as it may seem in this insular internet enthusiast bubble. For all intents and purposes of this case study, we're going to be discussing Mega Man X as a milestone of the fully realized mechanics and depth of story progression in the Mega Man series.
Contrary to common understanding, the original creator of Mega Man from concept is a man named Akira Kikamura. He'd later be joined by Keiji Inafune, an understudy who would take on a bulk of the production art for the game and, in due time, would appropriate the Mega Man series for himself and become the face behind it. By the time the X series was born, he'd essentially be seen as the creative driving force for most of it. Mega Man X marked a moment of growth and challenge. They allegedly wanted a more mature game, with a closed hand on familiar mechanics and an open hand on details.
Some have rumored that the Mega Man team was so adamant about change that the original redesign for X was supposed to be Zero, until some executive project manager shot back asking to keep the original iconic look of the Blue Bomber. However, the history that I know about Zero begs to differ with this.
The very initial roots of Mega Man X truly begin in an old Japanese arcade title called Rockman: The Power Battle. Westerners didn't have the privilege of playing it until the Anniversary Collection came out many years later. In it, Dr. Wily unleashes 18 enemy robots, which you have the chance to defeat with either Mega Man, Proto Man, or Bass. In Bass's ending, Dr. Wily reveals that he's working on a robot more powerful than both Bass and Mega Man. And later on, in Bass's ending in the sequel, he shows schematics of this robot that easily resembles Zero. Not to mention Bass's comments on the robot being girly looking and long haired. This explains why Zero is met as the highest ranking Maverick Hunter, and in the beginning of Mega Man X, is positioned as the power fantasy role model for X after the player is taken on a scripted loss to Vile in an introductory stage.
It's a planned, hard-coded loss in the beginning of the game that paints X as the underdog, which was a storytelling feat at the time. See, there's nothing more compelling and intimate with the human condition than a Cinderella story.
It's why no one relates to Superman. On Earth, he's perfect, and that's why he's alone. Mega Man is a fictional hero, and in the vein of fictional heroes, their greatest trait is their weakness, because that's how the audience relates to them. There's been a bit of a renaissance in superhero film and even superhero comic character building that accentuates that and yields an impressive level of mass appeal. Look at Batman. Batman is a ninja, a tech guru, and financially and politically, he is by definition the 1%. Why should we like him? Because he's an orphan. And Chris Nolan capitalizes on that lostness and struggle for identity. Because of this, we almost forget about everything else. Iron Man is a playboy, misogynist, a spoiled child born into money and national family legacy. And financially and politically, he is also the 1%. Why do we relate to him? His greatest enemy is himself, and he fights to learn the value of self-sacrifice. On the street, none of these guys are inclined to get on our good side, but they're broken like we are. Inafune and his team had an opportunity to take a machine designed perfectly and powerfully in every way and give him flesh. Without this, I think the narrative would have lost its eternal spark. I could unpack this further, but to avoid sounding redundant on this topic, I'd implore you to look elsewhere. There's already some pretty impressive content out there that dissects the importance of the first stage of Mega Man X.
The Mega Man Legacy controls generally never changed on the 2D platform, and were praised for their strengths. They went like this.
A flexible combination of running, sometimes dashing, leaps and projectiles. Twitch maneuvering along a 2D plane to read and avoid patterns of projectiles and enemies. Cluing the player in to new level mechanics so that they can strategize. Let's call it scripted foresight. Tight speed and jump physics that stay the same from the classic to the X series. And in an attempt to appeal to and grow with the adventure-like rewards of RPGs on the SNES, Mega Man X was filled with hidden treasure that encouraged exploration. Mega Man gameplay had a lot to pride itself in, and it was all in the engine at the time. Every shot, jump, and fall was completely the player's responsibility because pixel precision on every plane stomped out all the edge cases. There were no technicalities. There was just technical gameplay.
So you're asking me, how does this dovetail with the Super Mario series?
Mario is the historical face of video games, and even the most disinterested of lay people from my generation and the generation before me have spent at least one season of their childhood with Mario's Legacy on the NES or SNES. I'll spare you the bleak and, at this point, redundant look at the game's industry history.
Narratively, Mario titles on the grand scheme went from 0 to 1 and essentially stayed there. There was a small ramp in story as hardware allowed it, and that's it. Mario isn't known for a story.
An occasional dialogue box, a couple minutes total of voice acting, but at its heart, the mission is to save the damsel or damsels and make your way through these signature-themed worlds with signature select enemies and bosses. No one says that the Mario story made them feel something.
The Super Mario series is known for its gameplay. Its roots are as a legendary 2D platformer with the following characteristics.
Running and jumping with very elastic, flexible physics. Similar to Mega Man, but differently designed twitch precision in a much more controllable environment for some of the time. Featured power-ups, including but not limited to the canonical mushroom that gives the player up to 2 chances to stay alive after getting hurt in most circumstances. And finally, signature enemies like Goombas or Koopas, scenery with faces, and bosses with recurring roles across titles. These are some of the basic features. I'm going somewhere with this. Though very different, Super Mario World and Mega Man X were both acclaimed precision-based platformers that grew up together on the Nintendo system. And needless to say, they received very different reactions from fans when it came time to count in a Z-axis in the industry-wide transition to 3D.
For Mario, everything changed, but the magic wasn't lost. We got Super Mario 64, a title that ditched more than just the 2-dimensional plane.
This new non-linear medium called for a strong non-linear experience. Rather than one stage coming after another in succession or an overworld map, the concept of an overworld was completely blown out into a living, changing, explorable campus with portals to new areas. Hardware allowed us to step beyond the necessity of dialogues and abstracted menus. We could view and explore on a plane much more analogous to real life. A part of this world was the flexibility to progress in these different worlds in a partially controlled but mostly free order. This freedom of choice over levels feels very similar to what we can do in Mega Man. However, what makes it different is that rather than having a binary state for each level where it's either complete or incomplete, Super Mario 64 presented a gradient in the form of itemized tasks that allowed any stage to be revisited and completed at leisure, which made sense, especially in a new context where sense of place and view distance was a lot easier to remember in 3 dimensions than 2. And these levels were nothing like what Super Mario fans were used to. They ditched the mushrooms, big and small Mario, permanent power-ups, flagpoles, and definitive ending points. Popular enemies like Goombas lost their purpose once the Z-axis was added. No longer were they serious obstacles. On an open plane, they don't only lose their threat and need for caution, but they, as well as Koopas, effectively became bonuses, as they carry coins for health and shells that can be skated on. Instead of the win state being reaching the end of a race without dying, the player was tasked with exploring a world for stars. Developers broke down linearity even further by providing Mario with multiple ways of completing a level. This is what differentiates 64 from Klonoa or Toomba. It's not a relevant coat of 3D paint on the platformers we knew. It was functionally contextualized for true adventure and exploration.
In the transition to 3D, for Mario, everything changed, but the magic wasn't lost. But for Mega Man, very little changed, and because of that, everything was lost. And the decline in sales and statistical interest in Mega Man became clear, at least to Capcom.
Mega Man X7 was the first proper platformer leap into 3D for the X series, and it drove home a point that I think rang true for the franchise. The gameplay and heart of what Mega Man excelled at fundamentally did not properly survive the leap into 3D.
Let's go back to the list of mechanical characteristics that make Mega Man special in this new context.
The art of twitch maneuvering dashes, jumps, and shots around enemies and projectiles is snuffed out by the complexity of a 3D plane and obscured sense of space provided by a static and sometimes uncomfortable camera. It's the same disorienting sense of place in an environment that required the implementation of homing attacks in Sonic or Z-targeting in Zelda. The only thing is, X7 had none of that. Mega Man's signature conveyance, hinting the player about new patterns and mechanics before they happen, were somewhat possible in 3D, but can't be conveyed at the signature healthy distance or altitude in-game like it did with the side-scroller. If a player's camera was behind them, it provided a very narrow draw distance for enemy avoidance in an open field.
And finally, Mega Man's greatest prize of locked physics and pixel precision is gone.
Mega Man is comprised of a lot of jumping. It's a platformer, so there is much platforming. Player prowess is found in their strategically timed jumps. Platform jumping across ledges in a world of polygons is very different than in a world of sprites. Certainty is hinged upon the angle, and the opportunity to trial and error where the true falling off point is for distance or arc takes an exponentially greater number of variables in 3D than it does for 2D. It's not like the difference between this or this. It's this with this in mind and this with this. It's just not as simple.
In my opinion, this was a non-negotiable blow that contributed greatly to the awkward and wholly negative response people had to X7.
Super Mario 64 was able to somewhat counter this with ledge hanging states, and a reference shadow, and even then it takes some getting used to. This is essentially why any Mega Man that tried to transfer its magic into 3D might only find success as a completely different IP.
I'm aware of how extreme these statements sound, and I'm also aware of the cult following of Mega Man Legends, but this game was not considered even by fans as an appropriate successor to what they knew as Mega Man.
It's been countlessly referred to as its own thing, and falls more appropriately under the title of an action RPG than a 3D platformer. There's really no platforming to be found. This is what separates Mega Man 64 from Super Mario 64, which, though throws away a lot of what it's known for, is still by definition a platformer and keeps the proper sensations of being a Mario game almost naturally. We're out of the age of the platformer as king. Mega Man X came out when platformers were effectively the first-person shooters of 2011. They ruled the definition of games, and that eventually phased out. Even now, with an indie prevalence like never before, platformers have come back with a vengeance, but that's no guarantee that Mega Man can stand the test of time. GoldenEye was essentially the Mega Man of FPSs in its prime, and it did many things, but when the sequels were released in hopes of capitalizing on the relevance of the genre it started, numbers weren't even close to Call of Duty, because since GoldenEye dropped for the N64, so many other titles have released in light of what it did and are so ahead of what it started now. Mighty No. 9 is right around the corner. I'm excited for it and know that it'll be nothing short of enjoyable. It's a fresh IP with fresh art and all of the nostalgia feels a fan may want for themselves. This isn't always a recipe for excellence, however, and I'm more curious to know if an all-legacy cast like Inafune's will be able to create a platformer that could go toe-to-toe with Shovel Knight, rather than Mega Man 8 or X1 or something really old. I'm sure that they can outdo a 20 years younger version of themselves. I don't know if the freshness and character seen in Shovel Knight can be found in a formula that went into the platformers we played when we didn't know any better. I think through teams like Yacht Club, we might have something better already. How do you feel about this, though?
Feel free to sound off. But until next time, thank you guys so much for watching. Satchel Like a Bag Drakes, Super Mario 64, and Mega Man X. Copacetic.
If you want to learn more about game design alongside me, you can follow Satchbag's Goods on Twitter, where there will be frequent postings of helpful flashcards with educational bits about game design vocab and gaming culture. Otherwise, please subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. It'll ensure future content for the channel.